Welcome everyone to our first work in progress. It would be lovely to be together in person, but we're going to run this as a kind of more virtual session. What we're going to do is we're going to have the two project teams give a short talk, offer some reflections on their projects, and then at the end of that, what we'll have is a chance to have a wider discussion about some of the connections, because I think what's great about these two projects is that they both are using creative methods to try and interrogate the vexed question of the British immigration system. And so I think that the methods that are being adopted are really interesting, and as you'll see, I think there's some similarities and differences between them. But what I'd love to do is pass over to the Kept Apart team, and they're going to lead off and introduce us a little bit to their project. So over to Katharine and her colleagues. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So I'll just introduce you to the project team from Kept Apart, which is a project making prose poetry with people who are separated by the family immigration system. We've got Caroline Coombs and Paige Ballmi from Reunite Families UK. We've got Rissa Mohabir from Trauma Awareness, Emma Agusita from UWE, and Helena Wray from the University of Exeter. The team member who's not here is Michael Grieve, who's the illustrator. So on the slides today, I'm not going to be showing you the prose poetry that we created, save that for the launch, but I am going to be showing you some of the illustrations that were developed. Michael, the illustrator, also had experience of being affected by the family immigration system, so he drew on his own experiences and also on the words that we created in the project workshop. So I'll hand over to Paige to tell you a bit about the topic.
Family migration rules demand that a British partner or spouse of a non-EU citizen must earn a minimum of £18,600 per annum for at least 6 months to be able to live as a family in the UK. Income requirement does increase if you have non-British children also. This is a level that's just set really high, and in some regions of the UK it's just impossible to earn, and at least 40% of the UK are not meeting this threshold. So it's basically pushing people out of a family life. The rule apparently is in place to prevent a burden on the taxpayer, despite non-EU citizens having no recourse to public funds anyway, and it's very much stamped all over every piece of document they have. And the policy itself, it disproportionately affects a lot of groups of people. So we've got people from Black and ethnic minority communities, because they often get paid a lot less, and women who, especially those who are forced to be single mothers because they're being pushed out of the labour force, they're not being able to work because they're having to take care of their child alone, when if the child's father was here, they would be able to support and even meet more than 18,600 if need be. So it's thought that at least tens and thousands of families are separated by this one policy. There are also things like English tests, which some people can't, number one, afford because they're really expensive, and number two, not everybody has great English. And also there are people who do have degrees that were taught in English that still can't meet those requirements. And then there's things like incorrect refusals and stuff like that. So yeah, that's how a lot of people find themselves separated for lengthy periods of time.
Thanks, Paige. So I'll pass over now to, I think it's Caroline up next.
Yeah, so as Paige mentioned, roughly 40% of the country don't earn the minimum income requirement of 18,600. With the recession that we're going into, that percentage is likely to rise. And the financial burden that the visas place on families who are already on low incomes, it ultimately is unfair and cruel. Many people, as well as having to fund their life in the UK, whilst they're trying to bring the families over, they also have a family home abroad that they need to fund as well. And adding to that the fees, the hefty fees and the health surcharge, it runs into thousands of pounds every 2.5 years. And if you're on a 10-year route, that's an extortionate amount of money. And as I mentioned, the recession is just going to make that even harder for them. Paige touched on the aspect of the mothers working. Working hours generally for families, because they're trying to meet the minimum income requirement, often they're having to do more than one job, which is an extra challenge if you also have children to care for. And which then sort of leads into the childcare aspect of it. Because the minimum income requirement effectively, or does create single parent families, if the children is with the mother in the UK, for example, and she's either having to work and do the childcare, or may have to turn to the benefits, because both areas will be because the partner's not there to help them. Either way, what happens is the children are losing a level of access to both parents because they're either out of the country or they're at work. The minimum income requirement is basically telling you that you, depending on who you love and what you earn, you can't be a family. So it's controlling your life effectively, which doesn't have a place in society today. And this has huge impacts, emotional, social, mental and physical. From chronic anxiety, heightened stress, it puts stress on the relationships themselves, sense of loneliness, a lot of depression. There's so many negative impacts, and not least the huge impact on the children themselves, which is yet to be researched in more detail.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Rissa is going to tell us about the methodology for the project.
But bearing in mind what the introduction states, it seemed quite right and fitting that I was introduced to by Katharine and Reunite Families to create a community listening project, which is based on the methodology of trauma awareness principles. And as I was delighted to be part of this because it touches me as a migrant myself. The methodology itself is basically it's because it's based on trauma, a trauma perspective. It has a methodology which is based on creating safe spaces for the groups to be able to feel free to share. And without going into too much detail, but I think I'd like to stress that it is quite a structured way of listening. It's not a therapy. It's not meant to be for therapy. It's meant to be a collaborative, to create a very safe collaborative space for people to listen to each other, to listen firstly, to reflect on their own internal space, what's happening. So we have exercises to guide them through that process. And the second process is listening to each other. So we're building a trust in a group. And it was without a doubt this particular group, the group cohesion happened very quickly. The intensity of their experiences in various stages of their the processes that they were in. There was lots of themes and threads, and that led into what the result was, the prose and poems, which we then created as a result.
I should say that we had the workshops involved, I think it was 9 people who had the experience of being separated from families by the immigration system. Thank you, Rissa. And what have we learned about doing interdisciplinary or co-produced research? Well, one, that it's been incredibly stimulating. We all come at this with different skills, different approaches, and we've been bouncing things off each other, and what we've produced is something that none of us could have produced by ourselves. So I think you can tell by looking at the illustrations. We've had very stimulating conversations with the other participants, with the team, and also learned personally the joy of a supportive research team. We've been very lucky with the research team. Everybody's been amazing. So any hiccups that we had to do with COVID or me getting food poisoning before the workshop or whatever, everybody's pulled together, and it's been quite amazing. And we've also learnt from each other our new approaches. So Helena wanted to give an example of what she's learnt from a socio-legal perspective.
So yeah, I mean, I found this project quite revelatory in terms of stimulating me as a legal scholar to think about how I can do better research. lawyers we do a lot of doctrinal research, or we tend to use a quite limited range of social science methods such as interviews, focus groups, etc. And one of my problems has been that I've got an interest in what I see as an emerging theme of law's failure, which is to say that in the immigration world, we have really quite extensive legal rights and that we can have recourse to, but that individuals are not able to make use of them. And my sense is that this goes beyond just questions of access, although access is obviously very important, the fact that there are not lawyers about, the fact that it's so expensive, etc., and is around people's understanding of what law can do for them, or even the extent to which law is something that enters into their mind, which is very much reflected in the literature of legal consciousness, and also a new work that's coming up on legal alienation. But what I found was I was very much wanting to explore that, particularly in the light of the Windrush scandal, where in the Windrush scandal, everyone kept saying these are British citizens, these are people who've got really strong rights, what's happening to them? And yet legal remedies didn't seem to be a part of the solution at all. It was, in the end, it was all really political pressure, and even then, not always very successfully. And so I'm thinking about how you investigate that failure without coming across the problems we have of reproducing legal hierarchies, of reproducing social hierarchies, obviously, of adopting the kind of top-down, very positivistic methods that tend to enter into legal research, and even if we don't want them, and that then don't really enable people researchers very easily to grasp the complexity or the subjective character of individuals' relationship with the law. So I found this idea of a listening methodology, of that the starting point being listening, that yes, it is structured, as Rissa said, but that the structure is very much focused around the needs and the interests and the subjective experience of the individuals, to be quite revelatory. And I see that really as a little bit of a breakthrough for me in terms of understanding what I might be able to do to move this sort of research forward.
Paige, would you like to say something a bit about the benefits for non-academic partners and participants?
Yeah, so for me, as a participant and a partner, so for something that I've got lived experience of the family migration system with my partners from Albania, being interviewed for us, we had news stories. Anyone who would listen, we would tell our story to. So being interviewed was really, really normal. And being able to work with, academic researchers and actually have something set in stone that could be shared with other people it's such a lonely process to go through. And to put it out there and have the research done by others so that others can going through the same family migration processes, they can look at that and think, oh, wow, actually, I'm not on my own. These people have felt similar to me. And it was very a creative way that we did this. It was kind of therapeutic in a way that we were doing lots of cutting and sticking during the workshop sections. And whilst that may sound a bit primary school like, it was actually quite nice, and it brought out it's a different way of telling our story. So it was really nice to do that.
And that very much reinforced by the feedback we got from other participants, that they found the process of doing this supportive and engaging. So finally, you asked us to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. So I'll pass over to Emma and Caroline. Emma first and then Caroline for a very quick discussion of that.
So on a practical level, the pandemic and the lockdown meant moving all of the project activities online, including the co-creative process that we've heard about with our project participants. So the second workshop, we had the initial workshop pre-lockdown, and then the second workshop, which would have been an in-person meeting of the group focused on working with the draft material from the first workshop to co-produce the final prose and the content for the book, had to happen through a series of online meetings and correspondences with the participants. Obviously, that was disappointing, given that the first workshop had provided so much in terms of a sense of unity and support for those affected, but it was a really good alternative given the insurmountable restrictions. Carolyn, I think, is now going to talk about the impacts of the lockdown and the wider pandemic on families and partners who've been kept apart.
So, I mean, the separation from loved ones for our families is nothing new. However, what it did do was, with COVID, was to just put even more stress, even more uncertainty, and also change situations that they thought were okay. So, for example, for those families that had finally been able to meet the minimum income requirement, which is really not an easy process, I can promise you, visa and test centres were suddenly shut down, obviously. But what this meant is they were unable, those people were unable to get their paperwork finalised, and obviously, if unable to get on a plane to finally be reunited with their families. For families that were already settled in the UK, like myself, we were putting in for an extension. We've got jobs, we've got our son in school, for example, and sudden loss of income means that most of our families were thrown into chaos because they after being able to meet the minimum income requirement, suddenly were faced with not being able to meet the minimum income requirement, which will have a big impact on the numbers now affected. And especially as we're going into a recession, there's going to be more people that struggle with that. And also those who were wanting to get married, wedding plans that were cancelled, married life put on hold for an indeterminate length of time. And all of it, for all of the families, coming at a really huge cost, emotionally as well as financially. There was one shining light in those here on visit visas could switch to a longer term visa, which was not allowed at all. But again, communication from the Home Office was really slow coming through the entire first part of COVID. Well, it continues to be so, to be honest. And so what we're finding, families who have also got young children were thrown into, well, what do we do? We have no idea what we need to do. We need to keep within the law. And the Home Office were extremely slow. A helpline and email was set up. But even then, that was conflicting information. And this is something that we find our families deal with anyway. And the COVID communication was just sort of added more stress to that.
Emma, would you like to round off by reflecting on maybe the opportunities that's presenting us, this COVID situation?
Yeah, thanks. So in tandem with the lockdown having presented these increased hardships and the challenges to affected families going through this, the travel restrictions and social distancing measures have obviously seen a large proportion of the general population experiencing enforced separation from family members and friends. So there is a sense that this may have opened up possibilities for empathy and paths of understanding and connection for those people who haven't encountered the experience of family separation before. Similarly, the general public and politicians have been confronted with some of the impacts and the realities of hostile immigration rules and policies in a way that they simply haven't before. So, for example, we can see in media and public discourses about the value of the NHS and key workers vis-a-vis seeing migrants who work in those roles more positively than usual, so perhaps destabilising previous hierarchies. We can see that in Clap for Carers, the immigration surcharge U-turn by the government for some NHS workers. And we've also seen increasing debate about the no recourse to public funds rule for people living under restricted immigration controls. So in terms of communicating and campaigning on these issues, it seems to have at least temporarily affected the potential for a greater sense of receptivity and interactivity with audiences that we're actually seeking to reach and engage with about the issues.
Thank you. So that's where we are at the moment, trying to think about how to maximise impact. I have a feeling we've overrun quite a bit, but I'll stop there and hope that gives you an idea of the project.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Let's just take a quick moment if there's any immediate questions.
Hi, everyone. It looks like a really great project. I love the illustrations. You're an all-female team, so I was interested in reflecting on that and in the gender composition of the participants of the workshop. So how does kind of gender play in both in the actual issue but also in the methodology of the project?
Because of gender imbalances in earnings, this is probably something that affects British women trying to bring in partners disproportionately. I wasn't at the first workshop, so would somebody who was at the first workshop like to say how they thought gender played out in the day?
We had 2 men in the session, which I thought was a really good achievement, because we don't often have men coming forward, and we want to represent their voices as much as we do women as well. And I think at first they didn't really want to open up about their feelings, as a majority of men don't usually like to, for whatever reason, but they kind of warmed towards it during the sessions where we were being creative, when I mentioned all the cutting and sticking that we were doing. They started to come out of their shell a bit more and actually talk about how this affects them as a man personally and stuff like that.
I mean, also we've got Michael, who is the illustrator. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to be here today. But yeah, just sort of following on from Paige. I mean, we it was 2 mothers, myself and another mother, who started Reunite Families, and generally we found that men do find it really difficult to talk about their feelings. It's very overwhelming for them. And women, stereotyping gender, I guess, but the fact of the matter is we know we had Father's Day recently, for example, and the lack of men coming forward to talk about the impact of being away from their children on that day was astonishing, to be honest. But I think it's that sort of from the issue of the families being affected. It does tend to be that females do speak up about it, but we certainly have an awful lot of men within our group who are impacted. And as Paige says, it was really lovely and a nice surprise to see 2 men turn up willing to talk about it, and for them to feel they could was really important achievement for us, and being able to sort of get their viewpoints on it as well.
Let's move, I think, at this point over to Naz and Irene, and then we'll come back together at the end for other questions. Maybe I could just start off by asking you a little bit to tell us about the research project and maybe the central kind of question that you're asking within this research project.
Yeah, so thanks so much to the other team as well. I loved the title, Kept Apart, and the illustrations were amazing. I thought it was a really fascinating project. It's quite interesting to see it in light of our one, and it'd be interesting to have a discussion after about some of the differences and similarities about what we're doing. So our project is called Subject to Scrutiny, and it's a collaborative project with Bristol Refugee Rights. And the idea is to produce a film collaboratively with asylum seekers and refugees about the UK asylum system. And for those who don't know, it involves myself, Bridget Anderson, Director of Migration and Mobilities Bristol, Katie Bales, a lecturer in law, Alice Cutler, who is a Welcome Centre Manager and the Adult Safeguarding Lead at Bristol Refugee Rights, and Irene, who is Irene Elizabeth, who's a filmmaker, community advocate, and also involved in Bristol Refugee Rights. Just noticed I'm the only male on the 2 projects going on the back of the last discussion. So just so that people will probably be aware that the asylum system is highly controlled, complex, restrictive, inhumane, cruel, inefficient system, and that it has profoundly negative and detrimental impact on the lives of those going through that system. Now, for us, one of the things we're trying to move away from, and I suppose it distinguishes us from the other project, is that often many films about refugees and asylum seekers are often focusing on their personal struggles and making, humanitarian appeals for public sympathy or support in their struggles and their journeys. And these, of course, play a really important part. There's a way of creating understanding, creating empathy, raising support for causes and organizations. But they can also end up sometimes, a lot of documentaries can often be quite patronizing or exploitative. They can reinforce negative tropes about deserving or undeserving refugees. And it's very common in some of these films for the asylum seeker or the refugee to be, disclosing quite traumatic personal experiencing or sharing a story about suffering. And it's almost sometimes in these films an expectation or an obligation that these intimate stories should be shared. And we thought that, when you think about that in the context of the Home Office, often demanding and scrutinising very personal information from asylum seekers, which can be very humiliating and stressful. What we want to do in this project is trying to think about how do we move beyond this and think about the system? How do we use film as a critical tool and the filmmaking process as a forum for scrutinising the system? So the aim is really to, by engaging in a creative process of producing a film about the system, that we provide an opportunity, a means for those who've been through the system to put that system under the kind of scrutiny that it puts them under, to interrogate it, to analyse it, or to express their views or opinions about it. So in terms of our research questions and thinking, we're interested in the final film itself, but also the process of how we get there. So we're interested in what we produce and why. So, we can think about questions. We've been thinking about questions such as, how do we visually represent the system? What aspects do we focus on? It's a highly complex system. Can we do it without focusing on personal experiences? That's actually quite a difficult thing to do. How can the filmmaking process itself become quite empowering or educating, an educational forum, if you like, for those who've been through it? What do we learn, all of us, what do we learn through the process of making a film collaboratively? So, and that's quite a hard thing to juggle, because a lot of the time, I think, we see the film as an objective, but we have to keep returning to the idea that it's the process that is part of the research. The idea that we're trying to get to this film is a kind of a process in which coming up with the film about the system is a research in itself. So that's what we've been trying to juggle, and it's a kind of paradox that's been quite interesting for us.
Maybe I can ask you that then, Irene, is to say a little bit about what you feel like you've discovered as a team in this project, which I think is super interesting, in that, as you say, Naz, that a lot of the kind of typical sort of default position within a film is to, in a sense, look at the victims of a system as opposed to kind of interrogating the system. And I wonder, Irene, what you feel like you've discovered through adopting the kind of lens, I guess, that you've adopted?
Yes, what we have, this approach which Naz has just outlined has really given us greater insight into the system itself, because as he rightly points out, it really glosses over the human element. And in so doing our approach, we have actually made the asylum seekers and refugees part of the team, not mere spectators who are waiting to just repeat their over-recited tales. So the co-produced approach is an opportunity to represent themselves and to open up their voices and to be heard for a change. It is also a platform for representing myself and other asylum seekers and refugees, which is something that the system has limited us from doing, but something which the project is enabling us to do. For the project, it is already yielding dividends. And the actual process being an opportunity to open up their voices to be heard also means that their views, which have been long overlooked because the asylum seeker and refugees are thought of as not being capable of having anything worthy to say about wider issues. The system has stereotyped them, and this is being played out in the wider community, manifested in the derogatory comments that are flung at them in public spaces, in the demoralizing effect, for instance, that the actual system brings upon us, and at the same time, the policies of no work, which have fostered the dependency syndrome, which even, by the way, is a very tiny government subsistence allowance. But because if one stays in that system for so long, and when they do eventually, those who are lucky enough, I say lucky in quotes, to be granted a limited leave to remain, in other words, they are free of the government subsidy. But then you see, because of the syndrome, they have been so used to it, some of them for years, more than 10 years, that, they're now kind of in a situation whereby they need benefits to survive. So even when they can work, they don't know how to go about it, or they're having a hard time. So these discoveries have been found, and we want to actually capture them. And during the preparation stage of the preliminary part of the preparation stage, which is what I conducted the interviews to scout for participants, and which I shared with the team, discoveries that we made of these asylum seekers and refugees, of not only being oppressed by the system, but they're also experiencing negativity in the wider community as well. It has emerged from these interviews that they have been exploited by the nature of the filmmaking process. Their voices, their images have been used in ways that have not benefited them. And sadly, the system does not allow them to benefit materially, because of course there's a clawback system by the Home Office, whereby if they discover you are receiving any kind of money reward, they take back, they cut it back from your allowance that they give you. So it's a no-win situation. And this is something that, of course, we discussed as a team, and we discovered it to be so disheartening, because there's a budget which we wanted to share with the participant, but we can't do that, for instance. So as a team, we've discovered a way to empower our participant by harnessing this grief and turning it into a positive memory, by allowing them to draw, to nurture, to be the driving force instead of in front of the project, instead of behind it, and basically them telling us what they would like the film to look like. So as a core team, these are key discoveries we've made, and which are going to influence and shape our film. And the pandemic has exposed the harsh reality of this unequal system even further, in ways that under normal circumstances we all indeed are guilty of glossing over and viewing the inequalities are just the way the system is. But for instance, there are a few, and I'm mindful of the time, but I'll just cite a few examples which have emanated from the discussion. We've only had one meeting yesterday. This is our first meeting. And for instance, things which are not affecting anybody else under the COVID lockdown are affecting many of asylum seekers. One of them expressed fears of being detained during lockdown while they go to the mandatory reporting at police stations, wondering who is going to rescue them under the lockdown. There's harrowing tales of not knowing what to tell their children, that the shops are closed and they cannot shop online for that new toy, or when the children ask them why they cannot buy a laptop to do their homework on instead of the tiny screen of their mom's old mobile phone, which mostly is breaking down most of the time. And, and the mothers can't explain, because that all they have is an Aspen card, the Home Office equivalent of a debit card. And that is not allowed or recognized on online retailers. And they only get £37 and something a change. So it is really harrowing, it is depressing. And as I said, these are things that we want to actually find a way. And as Naz says, we have the challenging task of trying to visualize this information. We will, of course, I think, rely mostly on animation. But again, these are challenges which we have to draw at. But we are guided, essentially, and I want to repeat that we have been making films in the past, which and others in the community are guilty of these films, which are just derived from their own minds. They sit around a table or even in their own room somewhere and think about a film about asylum seekers and refugees. And then they don't actually ask them, is it what you really want to depict? And we were hoping that they would tell us what they would like the Home Office to have done, as opposed to what they did for them. In other words, if the tables were reversed and they were sitting in that interrogation chair, what would they ask? How would they ask? What would it be? What would be the outcome? If you're a failed asylum seeker, what would you suggest to do? What would the system really be? This depraved housing that is really causing them havoc, nightmares and despair and mental breakdowns. All those issues are things that I'll stop here, but these are issues that are really, really interesting and discovered. And I think my team members, some of them, I think, were quite horrified.
Great, thanks so much for that, Irene. Naz, maybe could I ask you a question about your own kind of reflections as a filmmaker who is working in a kind of film as practice based research mode of working, and what this project has I don't know, brought to you in terms of your own reflections upon your own work as a documentary filmmaker. because I was really struck with Irene's, when Irene was talking, there was a lot there around a kind of co-produced set of methods that maybe contrast with a lot of ways that we think about documentary film, or about the kind of filmmaker as auteur, or kind of certain traditions that have operated. I didn't know your own reflections on what this project's meant in terms of your own practice. Yeah, well, that's a good question, which I wasn't expecting actually, but yeah. But it's a good question. No, it's a good question. It's a good question. I think obviously my background is in, for the people who don't know, it was in documentary mainly at the BBC, and then I went into academia as a practitioner. So I've been in the kind of institutional context of making documentaries, and as a practitioner, I've worked very much on films about my own family histories of migration and displacement. So films often with my parents, which have been very personal stories. So this project was an interesting sort of kind of strange step for me, because moving away, it was partly having worked with a lot of personal material before, I was motivated in working with something where we came, and from a lot of discussions around films about migration and displacement, how we move beyond refugees and asylum seekers always, focusing on personal stories of suffering, and to think about the system. I should say that in terms of what we've discussed, like on this point, that our first meeting was yesterday, and we've had a number of obstacles getting to just this point. It's been a very difficult logistical project to manage. So we are about to embark on the workshops from next week. So a lot of what we want to discover and the questions we have, we're about to take place in the following weeks. We have discovered some things in the process. I mean, Irene has pointed out a lot of them. But one of the things for me has been, it's brought home to me the kind of the institutional and structural challenges that limit the possibilities of asylum seekers being able to participate or have a platform for representing themselves. And, that is, in part, I've learned a lot about the difficulty of which Bristol refugee rights and organisations like it have to navigate, just doing some of the most simple things. And obviously COVID-19 and the pandemic has had a huge impact on that. Just being able to, for their members to get access their services, they had to do a fundraiser to be able to get them phones and phone credit and so on. And similarly for our own project, that's the same, it's exposed inequality in access technology, phone data, logistical challenges and everything like that. What was surprising to me is that I realized that having to go through things like the ethics procedures in our university, and the combination of that with the Home Office restrictions has really, almost worked together and systematically trying to oppress asylum seekers. So in a sense, one of the things I've discovered is that our institutions are part of this system that we're trying to interrogate and scrutinise. And that has been something that we've continually discussed and thought about, how can we bring that into the film. So going back to your original question, it's moved me from thinking in a kind of more personal, subjective sense and thinking about the challenge of trying to make a film about the system, but with collaborating with others. Great. I think maybe at this point what we'll do is let's bring back the first team, because I think it'd be good to open up to a kind of broader discussion. And in particular, I'd almost invite the two teams to see if there's any questions that they'd have for each other, because I think there's some things that are really interesting about your projects, that you're not just using a set of creative methodologies to engage in co-produced research, but I think you're also grappling with questions about visualization and about voice and about, in some ways, the individual and the systemic. And maybe we could just open up to invite perhaps anyone to kind of reflect from the two teams back on what they've just heard of potentially fruitful overlaps or significant differences they see with the project. So let's just open up to that first of all, and then I'll see if there's any other questions that come in, either through the Q&A or through people just raising a virtual hand. Yeah, over to Emma first.
Hi, thank you. It was really interesting to hear about your project. And yeah, I was kind of all the while kind of processing the similarities and the kind of the differences perhaps that I was hearing about. And I think one key thing that is resounding is the processual value of the project is something that we found as being significantly important. So obviously in terms of the methodology, the participatory emphasis of the methodology, I think that probably it would be fair to say that there are similar kind of questions and quandaries when thinking about where the balance lies between presenting people's kind of personal stories and also trying to expose the mechanics of the system and where does the balance lie in that process. And I think that probably one consideration, I'm also doing a parallel kind of film project on the same issue. So many of the questions around visual representation also reflect in that. But I think one of the things that has struck in the project kept apart as well is about who is the audience for this as well. So the process and the participants have been incredibly important, but it's also this question of audience and who we are trying to communicate to and talk to has influences how you might present and represent the issues. And I just wondered, so my question might be to you therefore is around how you are thinking about your audience for the film and how that impacts what you're doing and how you're doing it.
I'll just make a very quick comment on that one, because it is a point, as you know, Naz, that we raised regarding our audience, and hoping that possibly funds permitting, we could actually package a series, because this is one film is not enough to actually try and even to dent most of the issues that are going to be raised. And in this regard, we'd hoped as well that an international audience, where outside the UK, is a very, very enticing one, because there's a lot going on in the world. More people need to know what actually is happening in the UK as well as in other parts of the world. And this is not happening at the moment. So audience, we are looking at the international community. Audience as well, we are not looking so much at the local community, because I think they've been bombarded enough with all this information about refugees and asylum seekers. Unless it is, again, in collaboration with the university, of which I am particularly excited to be working with, because it's always been my dream to use film as a research tool, and it's happening now. And as a trustee of the Bristol Refugee Rights, I represent members to the charity, and I also, being rather an asylum seeker, formerly asylum seeker, a refugee now, I have lived experience of it. So, and I know, and I've also been one of those who have been bombarded with requests to do presentations about my story and things like that over the years. And, you know, it does get, to tell you the truth, horrible at a stage. So what we really want is to have an outside audience. I think, first of all, Bristol is really saturated. If we're talking local, we have to try and aim for the national networks.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday, the two questions that we've posed for all participants, including the project team for next week, but particularly for the participants, is, you know, what aspects of the asylum system should we focus on? Because it's a big question. So next week we're going to discuss that. And the second question is, you know, who is this film for? You know, is it for the general public? Is it for other asylum seekers? Is it for an international audience? Is it aimed at the Home Office, perhaps? You know, should we make a film for the Home Office? You know, give a sort of reply back or something, you know? So I think that's something that's going to come out of the workshop next week, but it really is essential to the kind of film that we make. So I think it's an important question to raise.
Katharine, I think there's a question from Bridget about ethics procedures, because it was fascinating Naz talking about how in some ways the university is complicit with the Home Office through its set of ethic procedures, that there's a kind of systemic kind of double attack here. And I don't know if you found that as well, but I think you also had a question as well.
Yeah, the ethics procedures we sailed through, because although our project's about migration, we weren't working with migrants. And I know from my PhD students that when you're working with migrants, particularly people who are asylum seekers or have insecure status, that sometimes the ethics procedures can get quite bound up with following the rules, even when that's not necessarily in the interest of participants. So we didn't have problems, but I know it can be a problem. The question that I had was, I was just observing similarities. I was really interested when you said that you're probably going to go down the animation route in trying to deal with these things. And I was thinking about how we represented the system in our project. And our representations of the system are the illustrations in them that represent the system are quite abstract. There's the maze illustration with people trying to negotiate a red, white, and blue maze. There's the pinball machine to try and evoke how random it feels to people, whether they are successful or rejected. So I was really interested that we both ended up with we haven't used photographs of people, for example, but you've ended up with the idea of animation as well, which is quite similar to the illustration. But I also wondered about how you're going to deal with the style of the animation. So we had an illustrator already decided on to start with, and this was his preferred style that we think worked well.
Great. Can I pass it over to Naz and Irene maybe to respond to that question?
I should say that one of the issues here on the ethics, and this is where the animation comes in as well. I suppose we're dealing with something different when we're recording stuff, when we're audio recording or video recording, because that raises all sorts of issues. And don't get me wrong, I don't think we should not do ethical procedures. Obviously, there's lots of ethical issues that we need to confront, and it's important for those procedures to be in place. But I suppose the power inequalities are not recognised in these processes properly. And when we came, because of the issue of the pandemic, it radically changed the way that we were going to do the project. So, everything from access to equipment to, just being able to have online meetings with people who don't access to those things transformed. And we got to the point where we came up with the project of them recording their own material. And the ethics review, came back with something that each bullet point would have been a whole can of worms. And so at every point when we were trying to address the ethics issues, we then faced the obstacle of things that we can't do for the participants from a kind of home office perspective or from being able to purchase things, issues with data and so on. And we thought if there was a longer time frame to this project, we would have obviously addressed those issues and tried to continue. But then we reached a point where we developed the project into actually, in some ways, it's improved the project because we've decided to put them much more in a kind of creative directorial role. But the animation was something that was there from the beginning as a potential idea, as a way of keeping participants, the anonymity of participants and their identities to make it safe. Because it also allows for a way in which people can be creative visually, so they could contribute images. But now it's also become a way with which we can deal with some of those ethical issues and obstacles to do with filming and so on. I'm not sure if I got all of those questions that you asked. Katharine,
there's just one point, Naz, which you actually did mention, and I think I caught that one. It was about the participants who are a bit timid or rather worried about their image or how they're portrayed in the product. We did have that kind of a challenge. I speak in this way because the preliminary interviews to scout for the participants, I came up with challenges where I was being asked questions like, what is the forum? Who is the audience? All sorts of questions, even up to the fact that is any remuneration? Are they going to pay us for this because we've done this for so too long and we never get paid? And crucially though is we don't want to be, some said they don't want to be recognized. Others say we have ongoing asylum claims, and that really is a major issue and a mitigating factor into how much they can actually speak. And one participant is actually going to do a one-to-one. They don't want to appear on the Zoom, on the general forum. They want to do a one-to-one there. And another 2 participants actually pulled out as a result. I know they actually cited different reasons, but I know at the core of it, I know they were actually, they thought a second time and said, no, it's not good for them. So those issues are crucial. Identity, protecting their anonymity, and convincing them that the producers of the program, of the film, will actually adhere to confidentiality.
Great, thanks. I'm going to call on Rissa in a minute. Before I do that, let me just give you a question from Jay that's come through in the chat, just to think about. Jay asks, could you say more about the listening method of the first project, which also seems to link to the voice aspects that the second project highlighted? So that's just a kind of question to have a little think about while Rissa asks a question or makes a comment, and then I'll invite you to respond to that. Rissa, over to you.
Well, I just want to take up a little bit of the comments that you were made, Naz and Irene, in terms of the confidentiality aspect, because we put a lot of I myself, I work with refugee women of Bristol and other refugee communities, and to solve the problem of anonymity is that there's no recording also agreed in our project. And that creates that is one of the safest spaces that you can create when there's no filming or no recording. And the only way we to sort of mitigate that was to have quite a professionally a scribe who can do verbatim transcripts as we spoke, and those words means that those words can be reflected back to the group, so we don't edit in any way. It's totally taken from the transcript is taken from their words, and this has I've made a number of films, I've done animations, I've written books, and this is the methodology that I've used, and I think that's a really important aspect that I like to sort of encourage any sort of narrative therapy or narrative listening projects. So if that's of any help, I don't know.
Thank you so much, Rissa. Anyone want to respond to Jay's question, a bit about the kind of bringing these two projects together? That, in a sense, the first project, I think we heard a lot about the importance of listening, and Rissa, you talked about that in your own kind of methods. And Irene, you talked a lot about voice, about the importance of voice. Any reflections on that?
What I really meant was the voice of the asylum seekers and refugees, their true voice, the truth, not the glossed over version that we know that we're used to reading and hearing about in the media. What they want is, and because they've been silenced for so long, they really feel those who are not intimidated speak out, and at such great length. I think Naz, you bear testimony. They don't want to stop talking because it's like a tap has been opened, and we've discovered that as a result, there's so much hidden trauma and so much hidden facts which are not coming to the forefront. And we're hoping so much that because we've given them this platform, it's going to enable them and also empower them, make them feel, come out of their shell, the shell that they've been been beaten into hiding into, so that now at least this platform will actually give them a chance to speak up and be more vocal and actually be heard. Speaking is one thing, but being heard and being acted upon what you have heard is another thing.
Can I add to that the role of the facilitator is absolutely critical to listening to any trauma narrative, and adopting a methodology of safe listening practices are vital. And I can only speak from my own experience that they are key concepts and skills that we can adopt. And that's part of the work that I do in terms of training and helping people to understand this methodology.
I just wanted to say about voice. I think that one thing that our project is trying to do is also change as to who's asking the questions, because very often people are so-called given voice in order to answer questions that are sort of determined by other people. So I think thinking about who's asking the questions is really something that we're trying to do. And in a way, I think we're precisely trying to move we're not using trauma narratives, and we're asking people for their opinion on the system, for their opinion rather than their experiences, I suppose. And finally, I think thinking about, so there's some really interesting work done by somebody whose name now escapes me. but who's written a book. So she's a woman who was at Open University and who's now in Leicester, I think, but I can send the reference round if people are interested. So there's two things I'm thinking of. One is her work, which is on the politics of listening and being heard, and looking at the sort of activity of listening. And the other is the book Curated Stories, which I think is really interesting because it's basically it's looking at the move from, it's looking at how for the past, sort of since the mid-90s, people in various different contexts are being really encouraged to tell their stories, and actually storytelling is being sort of massively promoted, and that there are big issues to do with that, that storytelling in itself is not necessarily simply a positive thing, that we have to view that kind of critically. So that might be something that people are interested in.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you, everyone. I think this is a conversation that feels like is a kind of beginning of a conversation that can run and run. And maybe what we could do is we can try and find a time to bring these two teams back together again when Naz and Irene are a little bit further along with their project. Because I think there are some really interesting questions here about, like, as simple as how do you visualize a system? And that there's a kind of abstraction that you find within the graphic novelist approach that the Kept Apart team have taken, and will be interesting to see how that plays out in the work that Irene and Naz and the team do, through to these kind of questions that Bridget raised around the kind of ethics, I guess, of storytelling and the nature of listening and voice. But thank you all for joining us. It's a kind of slightly weird way of meeting together on a screen, but I think there's been a really interesting conversation that's kind of taken place that it's a real privilege to be a part of and to listen into. So thanks all. We'll be meeting again next week for the next work in progress as we bring together a few more teams who are doing research that, like these two projects, are very much about co-production and working with communities and not on communities, and also thinking a bit about a range of creative methods and practices. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and hope to see you again next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.